Living in Virginia, you're in the fast lane on the information superhighway. We've invested $3 billion in Virginia's broadband network to give you one of the fastest internet connection speeds in the world, so you can build relationships, bring new business to our state, and meet the future of education. It's amazing what we can do together. Visit VCTA.com to learn how broadband connects the Commonwealth.
From the General Assembly and the City of Richmond, I'm Woody Evans for Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Cox Communications, connecting Virginians to their government. Let's connect you with Delegate Mike Mullin. Good to see you, sir.
Good to see you.
Senator Monty Mason, good to see you.
Morning, Woody. How are you, sir?
Good, both from the peninsula where there's always sea level rise issues.
That's for sure. We were meeting with the Military and Veterans Caucus yesterday, and they're talking about some of the new leadership in Washington, talking about it's a privilege to have these facilities in your area. And so what are your communities and what are your areas going to do to make sure you're supporting them properly? But one of their key components was the ability to combat sea level rise and climate change, which impacts our military installations and our shipyards and Langley Air Force Base down in the peninsula in an enormous way.
Yeah, and I understand that the military is not real happy with this potential for drilling for oil and gas off the coast.
That's absolutely right. So the number one priority is that they have ingress and egress throughout the James River and into the Chesapeake Bay. And so anytime that there's any sort of oil drilling off the coast, that actually prevents them from being able to move large carriers in and out. And so that's one of the things that we've been working here on the peninsula to make sure that we don't have offshore drilling.
And we're not real happy about it either, are we?
No.
Of course, that's an issue on one of the committees that one of your colleagues chairs, Senator Stewart. I know that issue has come up. How has that been addressed?
Well, we addressed it with a bill this year that we kind of wondered about its reach with what it could do with the Commonwealth of Virginia, but we felt like we supported it out of committee, feeling like it sent a pretty clear message that we are not interested in that off the shores. And, you know, in our area, what is enormous, you know, we talked about the military, we talk about the shipyard, we talk about Langley, but let's not forget tourism. Oh, that's a gargantuan part of our economy down there. And any difficulties, any challenges with oil and drilling off the coast could just destroy the tourist economy in Virginia, in a significant part, certainly southeastern Virginia.
Well, you know, when we're talking about sea level rise, though, it's also talking about the fact that we have some of the land sinkage that we're having on the peninsula, and you were working very hard to be able to have oversight of that, weren't you?
Well, it's an interesting bill. HRSD has come up with a way, approved by the EPA, approved by Department of Environmental Quality, that you can treat wastewater to bring it back to drinkable standards, and then syringe it into the aquifer, which is sinking and going away at a dangerous clip. So that's what Mike's talking about. The land is shrinking at the same time the seas are rising. We're hopeful that not only will this new technology replenish the aquifer to a level that will allow sustainability for the long-term future, but it may even help either stop the subsidence of the land or maybe even bring it back up as the land pancakes when the water goes away.
No pun intended, but there's a ripple effect in terms of your bridges and your tunnels there as well.
Well, and you know, one of the things that we're very proud of is that after the investments have come over the last 5 years in Hampton Roads, we're finally going to be able to have the expansion of the Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel for the first time. And construction is going to begin on that later this year, and we're going to see some really significant changes in Hampton Roads coming very soon.
I think someone said the largest transportation project, or money-wise, in the country.
In the country?
Yes, sir.
Now, there's still cries of concern about the tolls?
Well, no one likes tolls. I mean, but it's a conversation that has to be had across Virginia. You know, you saw the toll bill for 81 come up, but, you know, almost no one out that touches 81 would support a toll. So now we're studying how do we expand 81, you know, with a tolling component or without. Certainly a third crossing in Hampton Roads or all the bit. I think we had like $3 to $4 billion worth of money at HRT, at HR TAC,
right,
and about $8 to $9 billion worth of projects. Right, so we've got right at or less than half of the money necessary for projects that we have on the table that we know about. And so, it'll have to be a public discussion at some point. What is the priority of project? How bad do you want it? And and there has to be either a public transit component to it or a tolling component or both.
And of course, there's been a tremendous investment by the Commonwealth in the Port of Virginia over the last few years. That investment could go literally underwater if sea level rise isn't taken care of either.
Well, that's true, but I will say that we've, in the General Assembly, made significant investments in the port, particularly to get to 55 feet. So the dredging that's hopefully going to get us that additional 3 and 4 feet is starting in 2020, if I remember correctly. So they're already doing a lot of the planning now, and we're going to end up having the deepest blue water port in the East Coast once again.
And of course, it's being widened as well, so 2 ships can pass at the same time.
Yes, sir. Widened and deepened, and no overhead obstacles for bringing in larger vessels in and out. The Port of Virginia is just such a dominant economic engine. I don't know if you've ever seen the map of businesses and centers that are related to the port, and you can almost not find a county in Virginia that doesn't have a star associated with it. So it's simple for us to sell it and talk about it on the peninsula. But we do a lot of, I'm originally from Farmville, Virginia. We do a lot of talking about it in Southside Virginia and in Western Virginia, the importance of having the dominant port on the East Coast of the United States right there in southeastern Virginia and Hampton Roads, and making sure we do everything to accentuate their business opportunities.
And Delegate Mullin, I know you were formerly a prosecutor.
Yes.
But you're really interested in criminal justice reform as that relates to juveniles.
Absolutely. I spent about a decade in the courtroom as a criminal prosecutor, most of that time in the Juvenile and Domestic Relations Court. And one of the things that I found disturbing when I was there is that we were able to offer a tremendous number of services to kids once they got into my courtroom. Things like psychiatric services, medication, wraparound services, family services. But that's only after they've broken into 5 or 6 cars and they end up in my courtroom. So this year, working with the Select Committee on School Safety, we found a new way of being able to do that. So we're going to now have, for the first time, people who are on the front lines of children in crisis. And that's our teachers and our school counselors. We're going to have the ability to be able to evaluate students and then get them services before they ever enter into my courtroom. So that's a sea change in how we deal with juvenile criminal justice here in Virginia. My hope is that with this change, we're going to start catching kids when they're in crisis, whether it's a mental health issue, whether it's abuse and neglect in the home, whether it is an issue with addiction. We deal with it before they end up in my courtroom. And that is, I think, a real sea change in criminal justice reform.
And of course, Senator, a lot of these kids are in foster care, and there's been a lot of problems identified with what's going on in foster care.
Well, it's so important to avoid, to get to them first, as Mike said, from the criminal justice aspect. But we're also working on the child welfare system. You've seen the JLARC report on foster care, a lot of holes that need to be filled. There's a big bipartisan effort going forward there. The federal government just changed what they call the Family First Prevention Program. And for heretofore, it's always been that it had to be a child protective services action first, and then you could begin providing services and help. Now the focus is going to be entirely on prevention. So we have the chance to get to, because the professionals in social services will tell you most of these families are known to them. We know of these situations in our community, but to this point haven't been able to get to prevention services for the child, for the parent, for the family, across the board. Now, it's a complete rewrite of the way we do it in Virginia that hadn't been done since about 1989. So it's a lot of work, but all of the professionals are excited about our opportunity to get out ahead of it and provide some of these prevention services, which is right hand in glove with the work that he's doing to try to avoid a criminal element that comes from not having these services up front.
You mentioned these services being made available in our schools, and of course, there's a move afoot to put more counselors in our schools, give them the time they need to actually counsel children, have more nurses and psychologists in our schools. How's that going in terms of funding?
So in 2008 and 2009, during the height of the Great Recession, we put a cap here in Virginia on the total number of school administrative staff that we could have at any particular school. And what that's meant over the course of the last decade is that as school populations have increased and needs have increased, we haven't been able to keep up with particularly with school counselors. So I was working with delegates Bourne from Richmond as well as Schuyler Van Valkenburg from Enrico, and we together on the School Safety Committee came up with a recommendation that we made to the full committee to bring our school counselor ratio of counselor to student to the national best practices, which is one counselor for every 250 students. Unfortunately, many of our schools here in Virginia, their ratio is so out of whack, it's 1 to 680, 1 to 685. On the peninsula, we do a little bit better, but we're still at 1 to 370. And so we are finally being able to work with the governor, with the Senate, and with the House to be able to make investments on getting that towards the 1 to 250 ratio. Both budgets now have at least $10 to $30 million towards that goal, and our hope is over the course of the next 3 years that we'll be able to make the full $110 million investment to be able to get all schools across Virginia to a 1 to 250 student to counselor ratio.
And Senator, I believe there's now going to be a requirement that these counselors spend at least 80% of their time actually counseling students, because they had been charged with other responsibilities at helping to administer student standards of learning exams and things of that nature.
Having to actually focus on the discipline and having the opportunity to do so is a critical part of getting the number where it was. And the initial Senate budget had a stage 1 to 250. It was like lower school, middle school, upper school, and then we amended from the time that we saw the first round of amendments. On Tuesday, by Thursday, we had added more money to try to get it to the 1 to 250 level and focus on that work. Particularly, the superintendent of Virginia Beach came and spoke to the Hampton Roads Caucus and told us that their biggest mental health counseling challenges today were in kindergarten and first grade.
Kindergarten and first grade.
And so, I mean, think about that. So that is not things these are not things that are happening at school. These are children coming to school with challenges and issues.
Right.
Back to the child welfare work we talked about. If we can get preventative services in before children come to schools, because then the schools have to deal with the child that shows up and the myriad of challenges and issues that are associated with their lives to that point. And that's starting at an enormous deficit, and it's starting with that child in a bad spot. If we can get there with services beforehand and get them, you know, it's like another element of early childhood education that
Absolutely.
he and I have talked about. Having the child ready to learn at appropriate level when they get to kindergarten.
Yeah, that calls to mind, I think, a piece of legislation I saw that would make it a crime to commit an act of violence in the presence of children, because they are obviously traumatized by that.
It's true. So working with young children for so long in the criminal justice system, that is an unheard voice in the courtroom. When two parents have committed acts of violence against each other, the child is probably the one most traumatized. And it continues a cycle of violence and abuse that perpetuates itself across generations. And the best way to be able to break that cycle is to not necessarily do it with the criminal justice system. I mean, we're not equipped in the same way to be able to intervene in a family. We can put people in jail, but that's our primary tool. What we need are the kinds of services that Senator Mason has been talking about, holistically being able to deal with not only the child but the family as a whole, to be able to make sure that they grow up in an environment that is not violent, not full of addiction, and not full of neglect and abuse.
Senator, these teacher raises, which apparently will occur now, bring with them some strings to local school districts, and there's been some talk about using lottery funds so that local school district will be able to hire more people and also contribute what they need to these teacher raises.
I think the number's about $40 to $45 million per percent that we go up. So if we're trying to get to 5, you know, you can do the math. And the governor's budget, and I'm not sure where we're going to come out of conference on this, but initially had put about $70 million additional dollars in to try to hit that lower third level to help them, and not necessarily allocated it towards the raise, but just giving them that money to shore up and give them some flexibility that could be used for the raise or could offset money that they have to put towards a raise. But so there was a mindful eye towards a lower third of localities that have been unable to give some of these raises across the board. And we have to pay our teachers more money. We've got to continue to raise the percentile of where they match up nationwide. But there's an element of that next year, the cost of running your school goes up that much. So it's a long-term cost that has to be borne by the General Assembly and the locality, because we've got to do it to attract and retain our best teachers. But it makes the cost of education, obviously, the foundational cost, start at a higher level next year.
What about the physical condition of schools in your district? I know that there are a lot of problems with that. One of your colleagues, Senator Stanley, wants to be able to finance that through the state borrowing, because apparently there are a lot of school districts in great disrepair.
It's been over a decade since the General Assembly made any investments in school infrastructure. And so that's meant that the localities that can't afford to be able to build or repair their schools have fallen further and further behind. And many, many studies show that if a student is learning in a physical environment that isn't safe, isn't up to code, isn't ready for learning, that it affects their ability to be able to learn and retain the information that they're being taught. We're lucky on the Virginia Peninsula that we have communities that have made significant investments in the infrastructure, but in many other communities that are less affluent, that's really fallen off. And so we have, Senator Stanley, I think his idea was about $5 billion worth of investment. If you talk to a lot of the experts, it's somewhere close to 12. So even with that kind of investment, we'd be far behind. And right now, the General Assembly is still not making the investments it needs to in school infrastructure.
Huge cost, Woody. I mean, so Newport News showed us their 5-year plan, $255 million for capital. One school's $50 million.
One school is $50 million.
The initial budget was $86 million towards K through 12 capital improvement. Okay, which two schools are we going to allocate that towards? Halifax County has come to us and asked us to allow them to go and do a local referendum to raise the sales tax 1% to apply that money to a school. Their high school is dilapidated and old, and the cost of replacement is estimated at $100 million. And Mike did so much work with his colleagues on the school safety committee throughout the course of this year. One of our schools in Newport News, a super old high school, has 86 entry levels. 86 entry. 86. So how do you secure that school? And how do you make sure that if there's a fire, you can get, so it's not just the learning environment, which is critical, but it's just the day-to-day cost of and having to deal with what in some cases are beautiful old buildings, but just way beyond the modern-day workable standard.
So obviously the architecture of these schools in terms of security, ingress and egress is very important.
That's one of the things that we learned here in Virginia. We actually do better than many states when it comes to school safety, but our real weak point is school infrastructure. Whether it is because you don't have secure entrance points, modern schools make sure that the office or school safety officer has direct line of sight to the entrance points. But that's not happening in many of our older schools. And so if you can't secure the building, you can't very easily secure the students. And so that's one of the things that we need to do. But when the cost gets north of $12 billion, that is a massive undertaking. So
are there any of our schools that use closed circuit TVs, for example, at the entrances or throughout the school to monitor security?
So, like I said, we on the Virginia Peninsula are very blessed. So I spent some time over this summer at Woodside High School, which is in northern Newport News. It's a fantastic facility that has some of the most modern technology that you can offer when it comes to closed circuit television. It helps students be safe from outside threats, but one of the things that we learned about in the school safety committee is it's really the inside threats that are more important. The day-to-day abuse and bullying that students find themselves in that lead to mental health issues, that lead to suicidal ideation. And so being able to keep a watchful eye on students so that teachers and school counselors can intervene earlier is important. That's the #1 thing that we heard when we were talking to students, was that they were worried about the stress, anxiety, and bullying that they were experiencing on a daily basis.
Now, the other thing I understand is going on in terms of parental concern is whenever we have drills in our local schools, kids tend to get traumatized, especially if there's a lockdown or an evacuation. What are we doing in terms of notifying parents when that will occur?
Well, and I don't know where that bill ended up.
It did.
Yeah, I didn't think, you know, so I served on the House Courts of Justice Committee, and Mike is now there, and more well-suited with his background than I, quite frankly. But there are a lot of ideas that you come in with there that make a lot of sense. Mm-hmm. We're trying to figure out how to get there, how not to traumatize a child, how to make sure you have proper drilling. But by the time you start trying to put the legislation together and determine all of the consequences associated with it, you know, it's hard to explain sometimes to patrons of bills. We get what you're trying to do. This doesn't do it. Or we get what you're trying to do. I'm concerned about doing it this way. And I think that's one of those that probably ended up on the cutting room floor.
Back to the economy in your district, talk to us a little bit about the importance of aquaculture.
Oh, well, it's huge in our region and in Virginia. Virginia's #2 behind Louisiana as far as aquaculture in the country. But there are also a lot of competing interests. You have the commercial aquaculture. You have our friends that raise just a small amount for personal consumption. But then you have boaters, you have landowners, you have people that want to build a dock and sit out on their docks. So this year, the Secretary of Natural Resources put together a working group to try to bring all of these competing interests together and to figure out how can we promote aquaculture to continue to drive the business and the industry, but at the same time be mindful of people and other uses, the public trust doctrine is what it deems it. And so we put a good group together and we're trying to weed out some bad actors. People that are buying up oyster leases for the wrong reasons, whether it's to extort a commercial group next door, whether it's just to keep it from ever being used, or whether it's to keep that channel from being dredged in an inlet in a way. So we came up with a bill that we hope is going to raise some fees that hadn't been raised since 1967 to give VMRC some more. 67, the year I was born, as you can tell, not that pretty good while ago, Woody. But so we give Virginia Marine Resources Commission more revenue and more resources to enforce and to help future leases, but also balance the competing interests of folks that we all have the right to use the water and enjoy the beautiful waters in our area and beyond. And we hope this bill has gotten us one step towards that.
But you're not just dealing with that on the state level. You also are one of our representatives on the federal level, aren't you?
Well, I am on the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, which balances all of the East Coast and tries to manage fisheries. Something that I didn't know that much about when I started doing it, but my position on the Agriculture, Conservation, and Natural Resources Committee led the governor to ask me to serve there. And that's been quite a learning curve, but an enjoyable one just the same.
A lot of competing interests there, and I'm sure that a lot of lawyers love cutting their teeth on this concept of riparian rights.
So when I was in law school, one of my first jobs was dealing with riparian rights, working and clerking for a federal judge. You know, over on the courts committee, which I'm honored to serve on, we actually spend a tremendous amount of time. Fully a third of all bills that come through the General Assembly come through the courts committee. And as Monty was saying, there are a lot of really good ideas that come in that just aren't ready for prime time because the language is important. When you're dealing with someone's property rights, when you're dealing with their business, when you're dealing with the possibility of them losing their license or even worse, being incarcerated, you have to be very careful with the language that you use. And so we will be there until midnight, many nights a week, just trying to sort of parse the language, make sure that all the T's are crossed, the I's are dotted, and the commas are in the right place. And sometimes good ideas end up dying not because of bad intentions, but because we just can't get the language right. We don't want anybody to ever lose their business license because we didn't do it correctly.
Another crisis that the Commonwealth is experiencing relates to eviction rates, and I know Hampton has a real high eviction rate, and I know there's some legislation attempting to deal with that.
You know, if you ever have an opportunity to be able to sit in General District Court in Newport News and Hampton, in Richmond, and many other places in Virginia, they will have full-day dockets of eviction notices. And so it's hundreds of cases handled by 3 or 4 attorneys alone where people are just evicted from their homes. It is an absolute crisis. So the Housing Commission over the summer worked diligently. Delegate Carr here in the Richmond area, but also Delegates Bourne, Delegate Price in our area has also worked very hard on that issue alone. To try and create a set of rights for those who are staying in the lease, to be able to give them better notice, to give them more opportunity to be able to be heard, and so that we're not just sort of churning and burning through human lives as it comes to being evicted. Virginia is one of the worst in the country in terms of that, and we have a lot of work that needs to be done. We have a couple of model bills that have passed through the House. Hopefully they're doing all right in the Senate.
Yeah, so that's a great example of a bipartisan group. Senator Mamie Locke in our area took the lead for the Peninsula and for the Senate, and they came out with consensus bills this year that everyone agreed to. And the realtors got behind it, the apartments got behind it, the Southern Poverty Law Center and a lot of those folks got behind it. So it really was a good combined effort for everyone trying to figure out how to solve this problem. Interestingly, a bill came forward that was not out of the group, and we said, well, okay, now y'all all worked together and agreed on these. Let's push these forward, see how they do. Let's send that back to the Housing Commission, and you can work on that this summer to see if we can come to some sort of consensus. So that was good work done.
Great. So I can feel comfortable filing my tax returns in the state of Virginia now, I take it?
Yes, you can. So, you know, within the next 6 days or so, the governor is likely to sign a budget, or at least send it back for further edits. And so my hope is that by the end of this month that everybody will be able to start getting their refunds here in Virginia. We've established tax conformity in our tax program. We are sending $220 to each family in Virginia coming this October, or depending on which budget, maybe even in August, $110 to every individual. We are increasing the standard deduction for the first time in over a decade, and I think that we are returning a number of dollars back to Virginians. But more importantly, we're also putting a significant amount of money into a trust fund that we can deal with next year. I think that there are a lot of good things in our budget right now, particularly the 5% raises for teachers. We're making more investments in affordable housing. And I think that as we go through this process of the budget, we're going to only find it getting better and better. You know, we always say that we have 3 bites on the apple when it comes to the budget here in Virginia. First is when we initially vote on it, and that's usually okay. Then we send it off to conference, and it improves. There's more consensus that's developed between the House and the Senate. Then we get a second bite at the apple. And finally, the third time is when the governor actually reviews it and sends it back to us with any edits or vetoes that he might have. And so I think that we're only going to be able to improve on that. And I know that there are going to be a number of people on the peninsula who are going to appreciate being able to get that $220 in their check in August.
Senator, we've got about 30 seconds left, but redistricting is on the table. Something may happen. What do you think will occur?
I was pleased to see the redistricting bill pass the Senate 40-0. I think the bill coming out of the House does not get us anywhere close to what we're trying to do. There was one component that some folks would like to see in redistricting. I think we're moving in the right direction. I hope the House will take up ours. And it's still a long road to go. This year, next year, and then constitutional amendment, referendum for the voters. But we took a big step in the Senate this year. I hope the House follows suit, and we continue to move down the path of nonpartisan redistricting.
Thank you, Senator Monty Mason, Delegate Mike Mullin. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Thank you for watching Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Cox Communications. Until next time, I'm Woody Evans. Mm-hmm.